we know that this is the day of Shviras Haluchos, and this is the day really of the Chet HaEgel. And it's very interesting that all of the Rishonim tell us that the Chet HaEgel was not really a Chet of Avodah Zarah Mamish. The Jewish people did not think that the Egel HaZahav that they made was the God that created heaven and earth, but rather they saw the Egel as a replacement for Moshe Rabbeinu, that Moshe Rabbeinu they perceived as an intermediary that allowed them to connect with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and Zem Moshe Ho'ish, and they knew Moshe was Ish, they called Moshe a human being. He's not here, they thought he's not coming back, they had a vision of Moshe as being dead. So it's very clear that it's sort of the Kuzari, the Ramban, many other Rishonim say that the Egel was seen to be a spiritual intermediary of sorts to take the place of a Moshe Rabbeinu. The Chet was that nevertheless to say that you play to intermediaries, malachim, whatever it is also a type of Avodah Zarah. But in a spiritual sense, it actually turns out that the shirish of the Chet HaEgel was not so much a rebellion against God, but a lack of faith in their own capacity to have a relationship with God. There's a famous thought from Rav Tzadok in Sidkas HaTzadik, Kishem shechayav adam lahamin b'HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Just as a person must believe in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, kach mechuyev lahamin bi'atzmai, a person must believe in themselves, in their ability to have a relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And Mimela, the Chet HaEgel, was gufa, a chisaron, in emunah in themselves, that they were worthy, that they were deserving, that they were capable of having a shaychus with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So if it turns out that in one way or the other, the Shviras Haluchos is connected to Shivas or Tammuz, which is connected to Bein HaMetzarim, which is connected to Tisha B'Av. And if our Avodah, as the Talmud Yerushalmi says, Kol dor shelo nivne biyamav, every generation in which the Beis HaMikdash is not rebuilt, ki'ilu nechrav biyamav, it is ki'ilu, it is being destroyed right now, and therefore our job is to be baina the Mikdash. Then it turns out that in Shivas Rabbi Tammuz Gufa we have shirashim that talk about the idea of why the Mikdash was nechrav, and besides the statements of Chazal of sinas chinam for the Mikdash Sheni, in Avodah Zarah gilei raya shvichas damim in the Mikdash Rishon. From the Chet HaEgel, we actually see that it is the lack of emunah in yourself that is a siba for the Churban. The topic that I want to talk about is very, very multifaceted, and it's very, very hard to summarize, and there are a lot of many, many different thoughts that go through my mind, so I'm not going to be as organized as I would like to be. But it is a perception of of problems, like a whole congeries of problems, a whole series of problems that perhaps we face both in the Kiruv world and to a large degree in the yeshiva world as well. And that is, there are often, Baruch Hashem, many, many exceptions, and perhaps the exceptions are the rule, but there seems to be a great deal of perhaps a low level of sadness, a low level of depression that exists among certainly Baalei Tshuva and among B'nai Torah generally. A sense of perhaps a grayness in life, instead of life being multifaceted, colorful, instead of an attitude of Ivdu es Hashem b'simcha, in which there is a simcha sachayim, in which there's an enthusiasm, in which there's a geschmack. There's often a sense of being imprisoned. There is often a sense of not feeling that one is realizing their potential. And the question is, how do we identify that? What do we do about it? Is it something that can be corrected? Is it simply a function of individual personalities, and there's nothing institutionally or systematically that can or need be done to address this issue? And I just want to throw out just a few different points to ponder and the like. Obviously, in Kiruv Rechaikim, it's been well established for many, many years, if not many, many centuries, that as important as the imparting of information is, to teach Torah, to give people yedias, to grapple with philosophical issues such as free will and determinism and Torah min hashemayim and Metzias Hashem, it is often said that the warmth and the love that a mekarev shows a person goes much further than even the information and the arguments and the debates and the discussions. The old saying, at least in Rabbanis, is that the Rebbetzins Cholent makes many people more religious than the rabbi's drasha. That's even if it's a good drasha. If it's a bad drasha, kal v'chomer, the cholent is going to do even more. And we see this over and over and over again. I'll tell you one Maisa. I think I mentioned it a few years ago, but it's worthwhile to repeat. Rav Chaim Ozer, who was the Gadol Hador before World War II, and he was nifter at 1941. Rav Chaim Ozer was not a professional outreach person. He didn't work for Eish Torah or Sameach or Lagola, right? He was not a Makarev per se. But we know at least one definitive person that he made a Baal Tshuva. There was a physician from Cincinnati, Dr. Samuel Schmitz, who was working for the Hayas, for the Hebrew Immigrant Society, and he was involved in transferring food and money to Jews in ghettos throughout occupied Europe. And he happened to be a Machal Shabbos, but he needed to meet with Rav Chaim Ozer, because Rav Chaim Ozer determined where the money would go and how it would be delivered. And they're having a meeting, and they're talking about all sorts of details. And in the middle, Rav Chaim Ozer takes Dr. Schmidt's hands, and he says, do you mind if I call you Reb Shmuel instead of Dr. Schmidt? Can I call you Reb Shmuel? Reb is a title of some respect, some honor. So Dr. Schmidt, somehow this moved him a lot, and he started crying, he started sobbing. And he said, Rebbe, I don't keep Shabbos, I don't wear tefillin, I don't daven, I don't make brachas. A doctor I am because that's what I got in school, but I can't be a Reb. And Rav Chaim Ozer looked at him, and Rav Chaim Ozer said to him, what do you mean? You're a person who left the comforts of America. You risked your life to come to a war zone to help Yidden. Do you think you're not deserving of respect? Do you think you're not deserving of being choshev? Do you think you're not esteemed in the eyes of the Ribbon Shalom? And Dr. Schmidt started crying again. And he records in his autobiography that from that day on, he became a Shomer Shabbos. There was not a single word of Musar. There was not a single word of Tochacha. He just had someone of exceptional greatness who believed in him, who saw his goodness, who saw the worthiness of what he was. And that was enough to change a person into a Baal Tshuva. There was no discussion of the theory of evolution. There was no discussion of the proof of Torah min hashamayim. This made the mapecha within a person, the warmth, the caring, the fact that somebody saw the goodness that already existed within the person was the motivator that caused him to change. Or we have a story with the Chafetz Chaim, also a very, very famous story, that there was a Bachar in Radin who was Machal Shabbos. And that Bachar was, again in Radin, the Bachar was kicked out of yeshiva, but he was told he had to meet the Chafetz Chaim. The Chafetz Chaim was not officially the Rosh Yeshiva, but the Chafetz Chaim was the boss, obviously. And you can imagine how frightened the boy was, shivering that he was going to meet. Somehow, we're not so afraid of the Ribbon Shalom. I don't know why. The emissaries, what about the Ribbon Shalom? But the Chafetz Chaim, he was really frightened to death that he had to meet the Chafetz Chaim. And he goes into the Chafetz Chaim, and he's shaking. And he comes out, and the story goes that he was a changed person, and the rest of his life, he was a Shomer Shabbos. So there was a Rav in Miami who was telling this story. And the Rav in Miami said, if only I knew what the Chafetz Chaim told this Bachar, I would have the secret of motivation and the secret of kiruv, but alas, I don't know. So all the way in the back of the room, this never happened to me, an old man gets up on a cane, and the old man says, Ani hagever, I am that person. I am the person who had to go to see the Chafetz Chaim. Wow. So the Rav says, so what did the Chafetz Chaim tell you? He says, well, I was shivering, I was shaking, I was quaking, I was so frightened. I was only 15 years old, but I was already much taller than the Chafetz Chaim. Chafetz Chaim was so short. And he looked at me with those piercing blue eyes. And he took my hands in his hands. And there were tears that were coming out of his eyes. And those tears were like fire as they fell on my hands. And he just said two words to me, really one word twice. He said, Shabbos, Shabbos. And in those eyes I saw the pain, the rachamim that he felt for me that I was not on the derech. And how much he loved me and cared about me and wanted me to come back. And then I said, I could never do anything that would bring that pain to this man. And then I extrapolated, and what does the Ribbon Shalom feel? when I don't follow his way, and that changed me. That changed me. So it's Yadua. That is the warmth that brings a person to Torah and that keeps a person to Torah. Baruch Hashem, by and large, in the world of Kiruv tends to be a warm world. The world of Yeshiva, I'm not so sure. It depends. Yesh v'yesh. I do know that there are many, many people who don't go off the derech. They remain b'nei Torah. They learn, they steig. But somehow they've gone through much of their adolescence and adult life and then weiter without having a kesher of varmkeit, a kesher of emotion with someone. And as a result, even if Baruch Hashem they continue to keep mitzvahs, it's often without an enthusiasm, without a cheshek, without a simcha, because there is no emotional connection they have either to a great Talmud Chacham or to the Torah itself or to the Ribbonei Shalom. And that creates a certain sadness. And sometimes, again, the whole phenomenon of off the derech children is a very, very complicated, multifaceted. But sometimes what happens in the next generation is that when a child sees that the parents themselves, even if they're keeping everything, don't have this emotional connection to Ruchnius, then mitzad the children, they get further and further away, till chas v'shalom you have the phenomenon of off the derech. But even on the derech, we sometimes have the situation of what you might call the walking dead. So warmth is something that one needs to value very much. The world of yeshiva tends to be a cynical world. It's a rational world for very good reason. And we sometimes think that those things are not important. But the truth of the matter is, they are very, very important. They make the difference between truly living a life of Torah and simply going through the motions of mitzvahs anashim milumada. But Baruch Hashem, I think largely, in the Kiruv world, certainly our Sameach, we're largely blessed with Rebbeim that do deeply care. But I want to point out that there's an opposite problem that exists as well. And that is, one has to be careful about what you might call over-charismatic leadership styles. Sometimes you can have a situation in Kiruv in which you're very invested. I care and I care and I love and I love and I love. And that's fine. And that's great. But that love means I want to micromanage. I want to make that person in my image. I want that person to think the way I think. Now, that also has many, many chesronos. Because one of the goals of chinuch is to give a person the tools to be able to make their decisions in life. Al pi das Torah. Of course, asay l'charav, you always need a Rebbe. You always need someone that you could ask, that you could be shayal eitzah. The concept is not simply we decide everything ourselves. But at the same time, if a person is hamstrung, that they have not developed capacities of independence, of being able, even in halacha, to at least go through a sugya before they ask a shayla. But I'm not even referring to halacha so much. I'm referring primarily to issues of life. Who do you marry? How do you raise your children? What schools do you send your children? The goal of a mechanech, certainly in the Litvische tradition, this was absolutely the case. In fact, Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky already 30 years ago was decrying the fact that within the Litvische tradition, it's tending to becoming more kind of going to the Rebbe for everything. And people were not developing capacities of independence and autonomy. Now, I know this sounds like a conservative or reform word, but it really isn't. It's not treif. The concept that a Ben Torah should be able to make decisions in their life and to understand the Torah basis for those decisions, to be able to think things out, to be able to be strong enough and confident enough that they can make judgments, is a goal of chinuch. I remember many, many years ago, I was zocheh to have one meeting with Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky about a very difficult personal issue. And I thought he would give me 5 minutes. He actually gave me 3 hours. I was quite amazed. And you never had the impression that he was in a rush in any way. what he did was, now that I think back at this conversation, and I think about it many, many times, he never really answered the questions I asked him. He kept on asking me what I thought, and I said what I thought, and he gave me studim, different things to look at that I didn't realize. And then when I incorporated that, he said, so what do you think now? And I said, well, this. He said, well, what about this? And essentially, this is a mechanech. The mechanech was margil, me, as he must have been margil, tens of thousands of people, to be able to get a perspective in which the truth comes out from you in terms of your neshama, your personality, your life. Now that, I might say, is the flip side, the danger, so to speak, of sometimes the emotional warmth. On one hand, emotional warmth is so essential. But when the emotional, passionate caring of the Rebbe, which is such a wonderful and important thing, turns into a micromanagement style that takes away the capacity of the person to make decisions, there is something a bit suspect about that as well. Charisma is a very, very dangerous tool. They say the Alter Slobodka, deliberate, the word charisma probably wasn't used in Europe, I don't know what the Yiddish for charisma is, but it says the Alter Slobodka deliberately spoke in a boring monotone because he wanted the teichen of his shmuz to influence people, not the style and not the pyrotechnics. He didn't want the style to be mashpia at all, and he deliberately went out of his way to cultivate, this is what they say, to cultivate a relatively boring style. Now, I wouldn't urge that on people. I think we need to try to be as interesting as we can be because our attention span is greatly diminished these days. But nevertheless, the point basically is that charisma can be dangerous, charisma can be abused, and I don't want to be marich in unfortunate pratim, but if you follow some of the news, it does happen that sometimes people that are in the Olama Shel Torah can victimize people through charisma and the like. Right, so these are things to talk about. So on one hand, right, life is full of contradictions. On one hand, the warmth, the friendship, the care, the love is so essential. Not only for Kiruv Rechaikim, but in Kiruv Krivim. A person goes through life starving for some type of connection. And there often isn't. Baruch Hashem, because of the growth of the Torah community, the Gedalim are, their time is so much taken that you're lucky if you can get, a minute or 5 minutes or something. What can you do? There are, Baruch Hashem, hundreds of thousands of people that need the Gedalim, and people have issues that are probably more important than most of the issues we would bring to them as individuals. But if I can't be a Yedid Nefesh of Rav Chaim Kanievsky, which is going to be highly unlikely, we need to find Kesharim in the Olam HaTorah at whatever level that care about us, that know us, that understand us, that aren't just there to answer a particular shaila, but understand the Reka, understand the background, understand everything. So on one hand, you need that, but on the other hand, you also need to cultivate, we need to cultivate midos of independence, autonomy. The Svarim say this is a shtickle remez in the bris milah itself. In the bris milah, so the bris, the covenant, the relationship that Hashem makes with the Jewish people is by removing something. Without getting into all the pratim, we remove something, we uncover, right? There's chitach, there's the cutting, and there's the priya, the uncovering. So in the Sifrei Chasidus, it says there's a certain remez that our kesher with Hashem is not by becoming something different than we are, but it's uncovering, being megala, the koach in our neshama that's already there. This is a great mafteach for raising children. This is exactly what Shlomo HaMelech says when he says, Chanoch lenar al pi darko, and the Gra says, this is Pashup Shad in the Pasuk, every person has their derech, has their uniqueness, and the goal of chinuch is not to change the person, but to be megala, the kaichais that are within that person, to enable them to connect to Hashem based on his personality. So it's not chanech lenar al pi darko, darki, it's chanech lenar al pi darko, and this is a mafteich. So in a sense, these are kind of the dilemmas that we face in the Torah world, Sometimes you're too independent because nobody cares about you, so you got to make every decision by yourself. No good. You're like just something, floating out into the sea without a life preserver. And other times you have the micromanagement scenario, which is also not good. There has to be some way in which one can have a madrich and a rebbe and a mechanech who helps the person discover the kaiches within him. Again, it's a pasuk in Mishlei. Mayim amukim, eitza belevish, v'yish tavunais yidlena. Within the heart of a person, there's mayim amukim, there's deep, deep water, in which there's insight, in which there's havana. But you need the person of understanding, the Rebbe and the Mechanech, or the parent, Yidlena, to draw up that water and make you realize the kochos that are there. So when we look, as it were, at kind of the low level, perhaps, of sadness or depression that we sometimes have, it's often because either one or both, I don't have a connection of someone who cares about me in the Olam Shel Torah that I can really turn to. And at the same time, I haven't developed the capacity to make independent judgment. So I'm so lost. This is obviously a problem for a choser b'tshuva who doesn't have a lot of background, but it's a problem for anybody, even a person who's been religious for many, many years, can find themselves surprisingly adrift as they confront complexities of life. There is another aspect, though, I think that contributes. We had, Baruch Hashem, a few days ago, the yahrzeit of the Orach Chaim HaKadosh. So let me tell you a little thought from the Orach Chaim HaKadosh. In Parshas Kiseitze, we're going to read before Rosh Hashanah, we read about the Parsha of Eshes Shafas Tayar, right? The Israeli chaplain of the army got in trouble with the Eshes Shafas Tayar, but I'm not going to go into that. About the woman that is taken in time of war, etc. And the Orach Chaim brings, actually it's not even him, he brings it from the Zohar, that the Eshes Shafas Tayar is a remez to the milchama against the Yetzer Hara, as if to say that kiseitze l'milchama ala yavecha. When you go and you wage war against your enemy, the enemy is of course the Yetzer Hara. And the Yetzer Hara captures the beauty of my neshama that is nimshelas to a beautiful woman, an Eshes Shafas Tayar. And the Orach Chaim goes through the pratim that this is a way that you recapture the Yetzer Hara. You recapture your neshama from the clutches of the Yetzer Hara. In fact, even the pasuk, Ubachses avia vesima yerech yamim, she cries for her father and mother 30 days. The Orach Chaim says beautifully, the mother is, you cry over the Jewish people that you betrayed, and you cry over your father, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that you hurt. And the 30 days are the 30 days of the month of Elul. And that's the whole process of tshuva, that's merumas in that pasuk. All of that is very, very beautiful. But I want to superimpose a thought on this. Rashi points out that Eshes Shafas Tayar is not referring to a case of milchemes mitzvah, of a mitzvah war, like eradicating the 7 nations, because then there are no hostages, no captives, you have to kill everybody. Rather, it's referring to an optional war, meaning a war of expansion that Bisman is that we cannot do, but that could be authorized by the Urim B'Tumim and the Sanhedrin. And the whole parsha of Eshes Shafas Tayar, Rashi says, from the Sifri, is a milchemes rishus, not a milchemes mitzvah. So the question I'd like you to ponder for a second is there something inconsistent or contradictory in giving a mashal for the milchama against the Yetzer Hara in a war that you're not mechuyev to fight? Now again, we don't have to be miyashiv the pshat and the medrash, but I'm just saying, l'chara, if you were to ask me, is the milchemes hayetzer called the milchemes mitzvah or milchemes rishus? You would certainly say, ein lecha milchemes mitzvah gadol mizeh. So is it not a little mudna, is it not a little strange that the Torah is merames to the milchama against the Yetzer Hara in a parsha that is talking about optional war, not obligatory war? Right? Is there a stira there? So I saw an explanation, which I'm going to be marich on a little bit, from Rav Shlomo Yosef Seven, who says a tremendously wonderful thought. He says, what is the difference between a milchemes mitzvah and a milchemes rishus? A milchemes mitzvah, you destroy the enemy. Lo sechaya, the 7 nations, Amalek. Lo sechaya kol neshama. In the milchemes rishus, you are permitted to capture the enemy and subjugate it. Says Rav Zevin, although it is true that the milchama against the Yetzer Hara is a milchemes mitzvah, but you fight it like a milchemes rishus, not like a milchemes mitzvah. Meaning, there are 2 types of tshuva that a person can do. Let's say a person comes from a past, not so good. Person now has decided to embrace the derech HaTorah, the derech Hashem. But how are you miyaches to that past, whether it's 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years? What do I do about that past? So psychologically, there are 2 approaches a person can have. One might be called amputation. I just cut it away. I act as if it never existed. I obliterate it. I get rid of it. That's called milchemes mitzvah. You get rid of it. But amputation has its limits. At a minimum, you're walking around with 1 arm. Also, there is phantom pain, which could be very, very severe. You can't really get rid of your past totally. It'll haunt you. It'll drag you down. It will depress you. It will continually give a person a sense that they're a failure. They'll never catch up. But there's an alternative modality of tshuva, which is not the tshuva of amputation, but the tshuva of capturing, redefining, retransforming. That's the bechina of milchemes rishus, in which the milchemes hayetzer is not the destruction of that past. The milchemes hayetzer is the transformation of that past. To give you a very simple example, if a person, let's say, to take an extreme case, was a drug addict for many years, and now they're not, they've done tshuva. Amputation would simply mean, that's not part of my life anymore, it's finished. But that still means 10, 20 years wasted. But if a person becomes a drug abuse counselor, and as a result of the very negative experiences, they are able to have insights that they otherwise wouldn't have had, that's a different situation. They're not simply cutting away the past, they're taking that past. And that becomes their aliyah in Avodas Hashem, in a way that they wouldn't have had. That's what the Gemara means when it says, Shuva me'ava, Reish Lakish says. The Averas can become mitzvahs. How can an Avera become a mitzvah? I understand Hashem forgives, Hashem erases. It becomes a mitzvah because that is the aside of your binyan in Avodas Hashem. I would suggest, this was a long way of making another point, and that is that sometimes the message that a Choser B'Tshuva gets, particularly in a yeshiva environment, because of the stress on Avodas Hashem and growing on Torah, is that their past is something that they must be ashamed of. Their past must be something they must forget. Their past must be something they must be menatek from. A person may have all sorts of talents, all sorts of abilities. A person has kasharim with family. And the message often is, sometimes explicit, often implicit, that just stay away, amputate. Amputation causes phantom pain. It causes a sense of malaise, especially when you're kailalit with the fact that you cut off the warmth that you got from one place and you're not getting any warmth in the new place. You're kireich mikan and mikan. And it is true that sometimes medically you have to amputate a limb. It is true, and therefore it is true that sometimes we have to amputate aspects of our past. There is no doubt that sometimes that is necessary, as it is medically necessary. But it's a last resort. Ultimately, we should be able to connect to our families. We should find ways to embrace the talents and abilities that we have. This is really what I meant in the title, Be Normal. not to, as it were, take away the kochos that the Ribono Shel Olam gave us, and fakert. If a person looks at a Yerushalmi, a 20th generation Yerushalmi, that goes back hundreds and hundreds of years with Torah and Avodah and Rabbanim and Gedolim, and they come from North Dakota, and they have nothing, and they look and they say, I'm such a failure because no matter what I do in a million years. Well, of course it's emes. The 20th generation Yerushalmi has things that I'm not going to get in a million years. That's 100% correct. The Eibishter gave him matanos that are not my matanos. But you know, the guy that grew up in North Dakota was given something by the Ribono Shel Olam that the Yerushalmi doesn't have. There is something unique that you take from that background. And that becomes your mafteach in Avodas Hashem. You know, Hashem put us where we were. Hashem put our neshamas where they were born and where they were raised, and there were reasons for that. And for reasons we don't fully understand, that was part of the tikkun of our neshama. And it's part of our mission in the world. And if a person understands that tshuva b'derech klal is not about amputation, but it is about transformation, they will feel a greater sense of wholeness, a greater sense of integrity. They're not going to have this sense that they're not becoming what they're supposed to become, because they will be connected to the wholeness of their being and the wholeness of their experience, in which even the zmanim of richuk from Hashem were in fact the mechanisms that brought a person near. Nothing to be ashamed of. And in that way, a person's avodah becomes more shalom. There is more simcha. Another aspect, again, these are just different aspects to think about, is that because yeshivish culture tends to be very cynical, we're cynical, we're cynical even about Gedolim, this and that, and we put people down, and that comes, by the way, from kanos, when you margil yourself in being a zealot, trying to be like Pinchas when we're not oev shalom v'rodev shalom, as Pinchas was. So you margil yourself to see the negativity in things. And when you see the negativity in things, there are many capacities of the human soul that become atrophied and stunted. For example, should a Ben Torah be able to appreciate beauty in the world? Flowers, grass. Do we even look? Music. You might say, well, that's not important. The only important thing is to learn Torah. Well, I would say, of course, Torah is the most important thing. But the Chovos HaLevavos did not think that beauty was unimportant. A person looks at the world and has hakaras hatov, sees the niflos habore. To develop a notion, when I look at people, whether it's a soldier, dati liumi or a chiloni, I can see a beauty in them, I can see a goodness in them. Even if there are shitas that I'm cholek on, that my Rebbeim tell me to be cholek on. But I can still see the good in all of these different things. Your life becomes a different life. It doesn't become a life of negativity. It doesn't become a life of judgmentalism. It becomes a life of love, and a life of simcha, and a life of hakaras hatov. Now, it's embarrassing for me to even talk about this, because I know people think, oh, I'm just being liberal or whatever it would be. But that's because, as Rav Volba writes very beautifully, we have been marchik the Eilam HaRegesh from the Eilam HaSeichel. And all we build on is the Eilam HaSeichel, which of course is intrinsically, phenomenally important in Limud HaTorah. But a person cannot be an Adam HaShalem unless they combine a world of Regesh with a world of Seichel. In fact, Rav Volba writes, that indeed is one of the main purposes of marriage, to give people the opportunity, particularly men, the opportunity to develop the Olam HaRegesh, as opposed to just the Olam HaSeichel. And thus, paradoxically, when we live in an environment that only emphasizes the Olam HaSeichel, we produce people who are not able to get married properly. Lack of shalom bayis, dissension, not being willing to give time to a spouse or to a child because of a cheshbon of bittul Torah. I love the famous story, it was a very famous story of Chaim Shmulevitz. There was a younger man who got married. He went to Rav Chaim Shmulevitz. And he said, my wife wants me to take out the garbage and clean up the house. It's not covetic for a chashuv kailal person to do this. The Rambam says the Talmud Chacham should not do malacha barabim. So how can I take out the garbage? I'd like to help, but what can I do? I'm an honest. So Rav Chaim said, you're 100% right. A man of your madrega shouldn't do these things. The next morning, 6 o'clock in the morning, there's a knock on his door. He opens up. Rav Chaim is standing in front of him. He says, no, it's a great honor, but what's the Rosh Yeshiva doing? He says, I've come to take out the garbage. It's not lefi chavaitcha. I've decided I'll do it instead. There's a message there. A person that truly lives the life of Torah is a person who cares, who gives chesed, he spends time with his children. He doesn't ask a shaila, if I talk to my wife more than a minute a day, is that bittul Torah? You don't ask such shailas. Because you know that a Torah dika yid is someone that loves and that cares and spends the time that the other person needs, and that is a chelek of their avodas Hashem. And that is a chelek of their growth. But when we live in a world in which only one thing is emphasized, as supreme as that is, but if that's the only product on the store shelves, then the person is going to be malnourished. The person does not have the diet that they need to be healthy. And I hope I'm not endangering my position, but I do want to make that point. There is a thought, and Tana de Messiahli, from none other than the Vilna Gaon himself. The Vilna Gaon was not a person who was not machshav limud haTorah. Right? That we know for sure. Right? The Vilna Gaon learned most of his life, 22 hours a day. The Vilna Gaon writes in Mishlei, why is Torah compared to water? Torah nimshalas kamayim. So all of us know water is purifies and water is necessary for life. Zak the Vilna Gaon, because water has a kayach to be matzmiach whatever is on the ground. If you have wheat, the water will cause the wheat to grow. If you have poisonous weeds, the water will cause the weeds to grow. Torah will be matzmiach what is in the person. The person has ava, rachamim, goodness, chesed. The Torah will be machazik and build and build and build and build. That's not the chiddush. The chiddush is, the Gra says, if chas v'shalom, a person is underdeveloped morally, a person has anger, a person has gaiva, the Torah may chas v'shalom make those midas ros worse by creating another opportunity for self-aggrandizement, competition. And that's why the Gaon says, that's why the Gra is properly called the founder of the Musar movement, because Rabbi Yisrael Salanter's Rebbe was Rav Zundel of Salant. Rav Zundel of Salant was Rav Chaim of Volozhiner's Talmud. Rav Chaim Volozhiner was the Gra's Talmud. The Parish on Mishlei was the very first sefer of the Gaon that was printed right after his death. And this is what the Gra says, to work on a person's midos. So when we live in the Eilam HaSeichel, disembodied from Bein Adam L'Chaveira, disembodied from giving people tools how to deal with relationships, how to care for another, how to go beyond our selfish egotism, then the Torah itself could chas v'shalom even make us worse. So these are issues that we need to focus on. Some of them are issues that apply in any type of care, others maybe are unique to the Eilam of the yeshiva. But in many, many ways, it sounds like a crazy goal. The goal should be to produce normal people. What do I mean by normal people? I don't mean normal people in the sense of mediocre people. We really wouldn't say our goal is to be mediocre. That wouldn't be it. We want people to steig, to become great. But normal means people that have a sense of balance and proportion, that you know how to be a husband, you know how to be a parent. You're able to relate to people. You're able to look at people who have different shittas than you, and you can look at them with kindness and with sechus. And you could be makar of them not by condemnation and not by insult and not by cynicism, but by an openness and a receptivity. To be normal. One thing I can tell you, I was zocheh to know Rav Moshe Feinstein a little bit, and Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, my Rosh Rav Ruderman. And what struck me years and years ago was they were so normal. What do I mean normal? Well, they knew Bavli, Yerushalmi, Shulchan Aruch. I mean, they, normal. They knew all that, too. And yet, they could talk to people about what they were doing in the Parnassa and in college and job, whatever it is. They were interested. They didn't make people feel like they were worthless. They were batal. There was a sense of a chashivas of a person. As the Alter Slobodka taught, there were Tselem Elokim. In fact, it's interesting that the Alter's whole limud was always, every human being is B'Tselem Elokim. And that also goes for the person himself, to look at his background, look at his situation, and to be makir that there was a goodness in that situation as well. Now, I remember, I'll just end here, when the Rosh Yeshiva of Mir, Rav Nosson Tzvi Zichrono Livracha, was nifter. So all of us know the famous stories already came from Chicago, and he was in a co-ed high school, etc. And Baruch Hashem, he became one of the really great Rosh Yeshiva that he became, the great Marbitz Torah, even Mitoch Yisurim, right? The phenomenal story. So the way it was presented was over and over again, meaning he came from nothing, he came from Tumah, he came from, such a bad place. And look how he was able to escape from there. Well, at the risk of being a little heretical, I would just reformulate it a little bit. That part of his godless was not only that he left, but that he took some of what he got and he brought it with him. The Rosh Yeshiva's ability, the legendary ability, to relate to every seventh grade kid from America, from an American co-ed day school who came to Eretz Yisrael, to be able to talk, to be able to be Arab, that women who were not dressed tznius felt comfortable going into the house. They would, put something on, but there was never a sense they were not worthy. That came from those experiences. He understood the nature of different types of people, and therefore it was not simply a question of escaping that, but fakir, the Rosh Yeshiva was zeicha to take even the things that we might say were not the most Torahic, and he transformed them, and he made them into his Avodas Hashem, the magnificent Avodas Hashem that his life was. And Bezer Anpin, in microcosm, a much smaller way, this is something all of us can do to achieve that type of balance, that harmony. And I think that the side benefit l'chal hapachos would be, it would give us a much greater simchas hachayim and a sense that our lives are rounded and complete and full, instead of creating the artificial compartmentalization and dichotomies that we have. So Be'ez Hashem should give us siyata d'shmaya to achieve our tachlis.